would like to say that it is a result of westernization. I would prefer to say that it is a result of globalization because of the relationship, because of the economic, cultural, all sorts of exchanges between China and all the other countries around the world. So they need a language that allows them to communicate.
In that globalized world. So in other words, it's more to do with globalization rather than westernization.
Yes.
Right.
Also, just a small point, I haven't made research on it, but as for Richard Kipling, his poem about the term Eastern and Western, he kind of really intend to distinguish East from the phrase West, but I remember the most famous poem by Richard Kipling is actually a poem called White Man's Burden. So that means that his poem is written, his identification of East and West are put under a historical context that is based on racism, which is pretty outdated.
Very good questions there. Sorry? Okay, Rachel has a point. What's your response? Okay, Rachel.
I just had world history, and we did do White Man's Burden, but that was during our African unit. It was based on what he had seen and everything in the Congo, where the Belgians were there. So it's not really about the East and West that we were talking about.
Okay, if you agree with that, it's okay. Point to consider. Okay, very briefly, please. Yes.
The point that Ian raised is that his poem, White Man's Burden, is outdated alongside his poem about East and West. So the point that she was trying to make is that his work is outdated.
His work is outdated. Let me just get one from Harry. Harry?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could clarify something. You said that in Christianity there are no forbidden foods, and you use that as a distinction as a Western religion as opposed to an Eastern religion. Is that correct?
Who was that? That was the
Rachel or Hannah?
Was it Rachel something about food? Yeah.
Could you just clarify the 47 verses in Leviticus 11, which lists things such as rabbits, shellfish, and pigs as being unclean, and not only forbids a man to eat them, but also to touch their carcasses. Leviticus is also the third book of the Torah. I'm sure I don't need to insult your intelligence by saying that, which is an Eastern religion, and word for word they're exactly the same. So I was just wondering if you could clarify whether your arguments about religion and food are based on liturgy or cultural practice.
Very good question. Liturgy is it ceremony? Is it part of liturgy, or is it just cultural practice that Christians are not supposed to eat pork? Apparently, not supposed to eat pork. Okay, but really, is that a cultural practice? It's something that's in the Bible. Is it a cultural practice?
When you speak of the Torah religion, what are you speaking?
Judaism.
Okay, that's correct. And you refer to it as Eastern religion, typically?
Yeah, I believe that's well.
All right. Noah, can I pick on you for a second?
Yeah, fine.
Would you, for example, in your family, do you practice Judaism?
Somewhat. We go to the temple on the holidays.
Okay. Would you eat pork?
Can we just stop there? It's being a bit too personal.
Okay.
So can we just sort of refine what it is? Because the question was about. What was the question again? What about
it's cultural.
yes.
You can say yes, it is
Culture,
cultural.
not liturgy.
Yes.
Okay, so let's not get too personal. Okay,
Yeah, I had a question for you.
Okay.
If the terms Eastern and Western are no longer valid, as you have argued, then how would you, if at all, classify the nations of the world?
Then how would you classify the nations of the world?
Like, can you offer an alternative classification?
Are there any alternatives? Who's this
To the proposition.
To the proposition.
We believe that while Eastern and Western are outdated, a much more appropriate term would be to the continent, therefore like Asian, European. In terms of that, there are other categories of which they can apply to economics, the northern countries versus southern countries, more economically developed versus less economically developed. There are many different opportunities that we believe are more appropriate to use in terms of international relations as opposed to Eastern and Western. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yes. Front here again, please.
Yeah, I just set up. So maybe building on this question a little bit, I just wanted to clarify. The question stated is that it's about whether the terms Eastern and Western are no longer classifications. But the debate really seemed to turn into, they largely argued against wide, like general classification, and they argued for classification, even in cases where like geography didn't really work out for Eastern and Western. So I'm not really sure that the question really applies to the debate that actually just took place. I don't know. That's not really a question for either
It's not really a question, it's more an observation. Okay, any more questions in the back? Anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak, come on yet? Yes, the back, yes.
So it's a broadly similar theme to Ella's point, actually. Edward Said, the cultural theorist, makes this point. He's an academic writing in the sort of middle to late last century, and he says that the way we have viewed what used to be called the Orient, which was a term for the West Indies and Japan, China, is homogenous and has led to a sort of skewed view of Eastern nations in places like the UK. Do you think that observation is as applicable to the thing that you're debating, which is international relations and the language of international politics?
So this is a question for both teams.
Both teams, yeah. So do you think that the observation in culture and arts that viewing things through this lens of the Orient, which is equivalent to the East, is that as dangerous in the sphere of international relations?
Yeah, so these are old terms. I think some of you in your research, they found this out. Orient and Occident are older terms. Orient and Occident. So the Orient would be the East and Occident is the West. So the question is
Is that observation about the dangers of homogeneity, of viewing things through a single term, is it as applicable to the sphere of international relations?
Yes, so is Orient and Occident applicable to this sphere? Who would like to answer that?
Well, the dangers of using them.
Are they dangerous
culture?
to Orient and Occident?
Are they as dangerous in the sphere of international relations?
Are they dangerous in the sphere of international relations? Who would like to answer that? Alistair?
Yeah, sorry. So we were defining the terms Eastern and Western, often because the countries in the East were often side together in international relations, such as China would often side with Russia, whereas USA would side with England. It's only used to facilitate international relations, as these countries often form alliances and have ongoing alliances, which we can see in the politics which we just spoke about when there were big deals on things such as oil between China and Russia. So it's not so much the Orient, because there are other countries included, such as Russia. So I don't think there's a danger when you're talking about the Orient. Although in international relations, I don't see the dangers. Those terms, I haven't heard them used much recently. So.
They're used in academic journals. They're used in scholarly journals and by scholars still. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Very good.
Both teams.
Okay.
Somebody answer this.
Oh, okay. Yes. If you want to do that first, and then after that, Natasha. Yeah.
So proposition just wants to say that we agree that the terms such as the Orient and generalizations of the East and West can cause skewed views in nations all over the world, because we think, as Max said, that dividing the world into continents already exist, and it's a less general means of dividing the world than Eastern and Western.
Okay. All right. Okay, Natasha, could you just very quickly answer yours?
Yeah, it's just a question for both teams. International baccalaureate study both the East and the West. If it's not going to be called, if there's East and West, that separation, what would you then call the international baccalaureate if it's studied both in the East and the West? For both.
Yes, Donna, you want to answer that?
The answer is in its name, it's international.
There is great discussion about the spread of the international baccalaureate and the degree to which, for all that it claims its internationality, it conventionally has had a skew towards the Americas and towards Western Europe. And there are issues about its developing internationalism in terms of its inclusivity for continents Africa and Asia.
Okay, so even the term, international baccalaureate has a bit of there's something not quite right there. It veers towards maybe some continents more than others. Okay.
Answer the question.
Go ahead.
Clarify something in your previous said it's founded in Geneva, Switzerland,
that's what I
as opposed to England, and so it's also often as organizations do, they spread out from where they originate. Their headquarters in New York and other European capitals like Paris, Berlin, Geneva, Rome. They're also headquartered in Tokyo, Beijing. So it truly is spreading, but it just takes time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, yes, sure.
For the opposition. Can you cite the source and methodology for the classification of countries as Eastern and Western that you used in your opening remarks?
CIA factor
And methodology.
and methodology. Sorry, would you like to elaborate?
So we're kind of arguing what the definition and use of Eastern and Western are. What did they define and use Eastern and Western as?
Well, if I can remember correctly, it's defined by GDP, it's defined by the way that the country is reflected, the GNI. There's also a lot of things that have to do with the relations it has with other countries, the treaties, the affairs, and also something that I saw outside of the World Factbook, but to relate them to each other also has to do with culture. How the Western countries were the Western European and also the United States of America and Canada had a much more similar culture than they would compared to countries that were found in Asia or the East. Thank you.
Okay, let's just see if there are any more questions, because there might be some final elaborations before we... Yes, Carl?
Yes, my question actually builds quite strongly on what Tom said, and I was going to ask a question quoting Edward Said myself.
Yes.
But we've talked an awful lot, or we've heard an awful lot in this debate about whether East and West is appropriate, but actually the theme that's run throughout all of your arguments is whether the East and West are accurate rather than appropriate. Another part of propriety, particularly in a field like international relations, I know this, having a master's degree in international relations, is not just whether something is good descriptively, but also prescriptively. I would ask both teams, do you think, whether it's accurate or not, do you think it's a good thing, particularly morally, a good thing to have terms East and West? Given that saying those terms have consequences.
They're approximate, are they accurate? They're not exact, but are they accurate in some small sense?
We believe that these terms are not accurate because they're binary. We don't live in a binary world. It's not black and white. As we know, international relations are a very complicated issue, and they're not either good or bad. They're more complicated. And such, they're not appropriate. They need much more, there needs to be more specificity to the terms in order to be more accurate to the situations.
Sure, to clarify my question ever so slightly. So Edward Said, for example, would have argued very passionately that we shouldn't have East and West as such binary terms, not only because they are arbitrary and useless in descriptive terms, but also because they're dangerous, as Tom said, and that the repercussions of those terms are very, very severe. So my question isn't are they accurate, my question to you is, do both teams regard them as appropriate in as much as they are good? Should we have those terms?
So should we hold on to these terms? Isn't that right? Should we carry on with them? They're not necessarily accurate, but they kind of, yeah. Is that how I understand it? Yeah. Who wants to respond to that? Do we hold on to them? As kind of rough. Well, I think the question's more sort of towards the opposition side. You want to come to it's Carl's question about whether we should still hold on to them.
It's kind of a question to answer a question, but how different are good and accurate? Because if the appropriate?
Yeah.
Appropriate or good, yeah, good.
Because if the terms are inappropriate, then they're wrong, and like if they're inappropriate, then it's wrong to use them in international relations. And if something is wrong, then it can be easily classified as the opposite of good. So that is why we think that these terms are inappropriate and thus
Agreed.
Okay, I think that's probably it, isn't it?
Yes.
One final tiny question. Is it going to be tiny? No question. The first one was not tiny, but anyway, okay, go ahead. A bit louder, sorry.
It's just,
Okay.
sorry, it has to be a question.
Yes.
A question, please, yes. Because you've got to decide in the end which team you think has given you the Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end. Okay, let's give everybody a whisk them away, and we will deliberate while they're out. Thank you very much.